Welcome to everyone joining us today for the sixth and final presentation in this academic year's Animals and Society Research Initiative Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Ness Houghton, and I'm an interdisciplinary MA student in philosophy and law at the University of Victoria. I'm also a member of the Animals and Society Research Initiative and founder of UVic's first critical animal studies reading club. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Yamini Narayanan from the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. She will be presenting under the title Animating Caste, Visceral Geographies of Pigs, Caste, and Violent Nationalisms in Chennai City. Dr. Narayanan is a senior lecturer in international and community development at Deakin University, Melbourne. Her work explores how animals are instrumentalized in sectarian, casteist, and fascist ideologies in India. Yamini is a fellow of the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics, an honor that is conferred through nomination or invitation only. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Narayanan.
Thank you so much, Ness. I would also like to begin by paying my deep respects to the traditional owners of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin nations where I live and work, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, to the traditional owners in both Australia and in Canada. I am so honored and grateful to Professor Manisha Dekha for inviting me to do this talk. Professor Dekha's work has had such a profound influence on my own work on animals and identity politics in India in the last few years. And I actually truly wish to acknowledge that her interest in my work has not only been a support, but in fact, a comfort as well in doing this emotionally difficult work. And thanks to Holly Cecil for facilitating such a seamless coordination of the talk, which has really been a godsend to mine, given how disorganized I generally am. I would also like to acknowledge Professor Jennifer Walsh, though she's not here at the lecture today, because this research is an outcome of an Australian Research Council funded project where Professor Walsh is also a partner investigator. So I had, between 2014 and 2017, on the back of another ARC grant, had been intensively involved in substantial empirical research that focused on India's cow protection politics. It was also in 2014, right when I started my research, that the Hindu Nationalist Party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, as they're more commonly known, they came to power, and Narendra Modi became the Prime Minister of India. And almost immediately, what started to follow in 2014, in a much more purposive, explicit, and a very directed fashion, was the lynching, the rape, and even killings of Muslims and Dalits. Dalits were formerly regarded as the untouchables of the Hindu caste system in the name of cow protection. Right now, so in India, cows are amongst the most publicly visible and also publicly most politicized animal in right-wing politics, right? So the cow, implicitly a lactating cow, is regarded as the mother of Hindus, not necessarily in pluralistic Hindu worldviews generally, because Hinduism is a very diverse religion, but certainly in a Hindu nationalist worldview. And the mother cow stands as a stand-in for Mother India herself, so to speak. And these are some of the images that I'm sharing here that are actually crudely circulated by many Hindu ultranationalist parties. So, for example, you can see the image on the left, which shows this noble Hindu king attacking this monstrous Muslim butcher who is twice the size, and he's basically attacking him and chopping off his arm, preventing him from butchering the cow. And in the image below, you can actually see the Hindu cow adorned with swastika. Swastika nothing to do with Nazi swastika, but it's an auspicious symbol in Hinduism of prosperity and wealth. But there's a saffron-clad hand which is trying to prevent this green Islamic hand from butchering the cow. And in the other image, Save Cow, Save India, a saffron India, which is saffron is a color of Hindu ultranationalism, saving the cow stands in for saving the mother nation itself, right? So these are really crude images, but they do a pretty good job of circulating the propagandist message of Hindu ultranationalism. And I've done some, and you know, cow slaughter per se is prohibited in almost most Indian states. And a lot of my work demonstrates that what we have in India is basically an industrial scale of underground cow slaughter, because cow protection, the way that cow protection operates under the cold economic logics of dairying is that basically, of course, it doesn't work. In India, as elsewhere, cow slaughter is simply not feasible. What basically is possible is basically an underground scale of cow slaughter. And these are some of the images that I took as part of my research, where outside of, you know, one of the ways in which we identify in India that this is a dairy colony, for example, is the number of calves all along the roads who are just being starved to death, right? And there's this really young calf that's just surrounded by chapati. Someone has just thrown rotis and, you know, the Indian bread at it, at the calf, and it really messes with your head when you see these sorts of images, because it demonstrates that that, you know, against core logics of dairying, cow slaughter is obviously an impossibility, but the narrative still operates that, you know, someone still console themselves that they managed to feed the animal. And but what stood out for me, what really stood out for me, and what will be the focus of my talk today with reference to another animal, the pigs, was how caste was deployed in the instrumentalization and weaponization of an animal, the cows as the pigs, who are both economic capital and political capital, right? And caste is deployed to determine which breeds or castes of animal are killable and which are savable, so to speak, right? So in my interviews, for example, I would, you know, the cold economic logics of dairying, and India is one of the largest dairy countries in the world, determine obviously the cows must be slaughtered. But how do you justify which breed or which race of cows, so to speak, are slaughtered? And this is a notice board. This is a notice board that I took from a photograph that I took from a notice board outside of a Hindu temple. It's in Andhra Pradesh, so the language is in Telugu, but it's really very plainly understood. So what the image is saying is that native cows, that is native Indian breeds, that is high caste breeds of cows, you can bring into the Gaushala, which is a Hindu cow shelter, but not the jerseys. It literally says not the Jersey cows. So not all cows, according to a Hindu caste imagination, are worthy of protection, but it's only the breeds that are determined to be high caste. So it is not basically, however, it is not basically only sociology that upholds caste, the political economy of caste, but it's also the economy itself, right? So in order to make dairying possible, it obviously it becomes important to make sure that some cows are killable, and this is not according to the Indian legal system, by the way, which makes no distinctions between native breeds or Jersey breeds, or, you know, between, that doesn't make a distinction between castes of cows. But this is purely in the Hindu caste imagination. So this is basically the justification and the rationale that is advanced by Hindu gaushalas, that are cow shelters, or by temples, who basically try to advance this narrative that certain breeds of cows are outside of caste. So if Jersey is outside of caste, then they are rendered killable. They're considered to be American cows or Western cows. So it's not necessarily a charge against or hostility to Americanism per se, but basically that the cow does lie outside caste. So in effect, so here's this really interesting image that, again, a Hindu nationalist party, which basically is going to great lengths to say the Jersey, because it lacks certain physical features, is not a cow. If it is not a cow, according to a Hindu nationalist worldview, then the cow lies outside of caste, right? So and I've demonstrated in my previous work about how these sorts of distinctions of different breeds of cows and buffaloes are justified on a caste basis. But I want to focus, as I said, on another animal, which is also mobilized to engineer the racially pure Hindu nation and also resistance to this nation. Okay, and what is interesting to me about pigs is that the pig is actually the diametrical opposite, so to speak, of the sacred cow. The low caste, untouchable, filthy pig, as opposed to the sacred, divine, holy cow. But these animals, though they're diametrically opposite and framed in such different lenses, are used in almost similar ways to mobilize a racially pure Hindu nation, but also resistance to this Hindu nation. So, and far less known about is known about the pigs. And this is something that I actually had observed when towards the end of my cow research, and I started to actually realize, hang on, it's not just cows in this multi-species Indian political landscape, but it's teeming with other animals. But one of the things that actually struck me was how invisible the pig is, even in Indian animal advocacy. So when Indian animal advocates do speak on behalf of the pigs, oftentimes it is, based on footage of photographs that is circulated by Humane Society International, United States, for example. But there is very little, almost virtually non-existent advocacy that is sort of born out of India, so to speak. Conceptually, the filthy, unclean pig is associated with the Dalits, the former untouchables of the Indian caste system. In contrast to the sacred cow, who is associated with the Brahmins or the upper caste in the Hindu caste imagination. The pig is literally referenced colloquially as sua in Hindi, which almost means the same in Hindi as it does in English. Socially and physically filthy, untouchable, associated quite literally with excrement, both their own and the humans. So as pure as the cow is, the pig is a sociological pollutant, and it's a sociological pollutant. This is the distinction that I'd like to make. And both pig bodies and Dalit bodies, historically and contemporaneously, are located at the margins of caste geographies in India. And in locating them in the margins of caste geographies in India, I'm going to quite literally be taking you later in the talk to the dumping grounds, the filthy, stinking dumping grounds that often line the periphery of Indian cities. Now, okay, so now the creation and sustaining of socio-political binaries, generally to create binaries, polarizing or divisive binaries, is generally vital to the creation of nation states. And this binary making has particularly been really important to fashioning the post-colonial state in India post-independence, right? And caste is core to the construction of the idea of polarized sociological binaries in India. Like, there's enormous work done by theorists and sociologists of castes in India, who argue that even categories like upper caste, lower caste, or Brahmin or Dalit, for example, are actually, they kind of presuppose monolithic wholesale categories. And they disregard, and I'm quoting a critical caste theorist, Dipankar Gupta here, who says these kind of wholesale categories disregards the multiple and idiosyncratic hierarchies that actually constitute caste. There's so many subcastes and sub-subcastes, and it is really impossible to actually sort of categorize caste in these large monolithic categories. However, the function that these monolithic categories do is advance and solidify binaries. And these binaries are important for to advance nationalism. So nationalisms need binaries to sustain themselves through the inclusion and through the exclusion of racialized, or in this case, casteized identities. And they are important, as I'll demonstrate here, not only the making of Hindutva nationalism, that is Hindu nationalist nationalism, but also Dalit nationalism. So even a whole spectrum of other nationalisms, including the Dalit Right. And this was a poster that animal activists in India shared with me, and this was during my cow research. And this was when I hadn't really started my work on pigs at that point. But it's such a telling poster. Again, this is from Chennai, and the language is in Tamil. But basically, I think again the pictures are just so self-evident and obvious in themselves. So the upper upper part of the poster is this Muslim fundamentalist group that is basically trying to, provoke violence and hate by basically saying, take a cow, chop her up, throw her into a temple, let's offend the Hindus. And in retaliation, you have a Hindu fundamentalist group that's got a picture of pigs, and they're basically saying, let's chop up the pigs, chop a pig, throw them into a mosque, and this becomes a retaliation. And you can actually see how literally animal bodies become warscapes, right? It is on animal bodies that Hindu and Muslim nationalism or fundamentalism in this case are waged. So they become really important. But my argument is that while caste binaries are crucial, obviously, to solidify nationalistic binaries in India, animals actually are core political metaphors to sustain the typologies of polarizing caste and in maintaining adversarial caste positions and hierarchies and nationalistic binaries. So animals are not just peripheral, they're not just interesting, or they're just not something that happens as a interesting side event, but they're actually core metaphors, in my view, to sustain the typologies of polarizing caste itself. So animals are central to sustaining polarizing caste. So quickly to give you an overview of what of caste and the relationship between casteism and speciesism, there's been obviously some really excellent work done in Western scholarship about the nexus between race and species, and I refer very extensively to the work of scholars like Manisha Dekha here. But despite the profuse presence of animals throughout caste sociologies, and despite the metapolitics around cow protection, specifically in India, the animal actually remains severely under-theorized in studies of caste. And correspondingly, caste is also understudied in animal studies, right? Despite the fact that actually 20% of the world's population may claim a caste identity, caste hasn't received, more generally, even aside from the animal factor, caste generally hasn't received the same sort of attention that racial discrimination has. So what is caste? Very quickly, caste is a form of social stratification of an ethnic group, right? Characterized by endogamy, which is typically marrying within the same caste, hereditary inheritance of a lifestyle, which often includes an occupational identity, so basically inheriting labor, which becomes again important as we proceed through the talk. Ritual status in hierarchy, so the hierarchy has a ritual element to it. Customary social interaction, both between castes, within castes, but also between one caste and another. And this is important, exclusions based on cultural identities of purity and pollution. Okay, so purity and pollution have these sociological dimensions where a particular group may become impure or be fouled simply by association with another group. So it is really insidious. The way that casteism operates is extraordinarily insidious. And untouchability is possibly one of the greatest violations of caste, because on the basis of an association with a human who's considered to be an untouchable, another human group is regarded to be befouled, and they have a whole range of discriminations therefore associated with them. And in India, and in much of South Asia, especially countries like Nepal. But again, caste is not necessarily unique to just the Hindu social framework, but also the Islamic social framework. But more broadly, caste in South Asia is regarded as a fundamental determinant of social exclusion and development. Okay, it is core, it's a fundamental determinant of social exclusion and development. And it actually also has parallel, if not similar, but it does have parallel implications for the well-being of animals. Because it is not just humans who have an assigned caste identity in the Hindu imagination, but animals also inherently possess caste and are born into caste. Okay, so a cow is born into caste, and a pig is born into caste, and a dog is born into caste. And as in the human case, they are seen as inherently possessing certain social qualities associated with that caste. So caste carries social qualities. You're inherently possessing certain social qualities, and humans who are born into a certain caste and animals who are born into a certain caste both share those social qualities, right? Sorry. So in some of the other work, I have argued that caste and species can both be understood in some ways to constitute descent-based oppressions, because you're really born into it, and stigmatized humans and non-humans, including exalted non-humans, may experience doubly reinforcing oppressions. So these oppressions are doubly reinforcing, not only because of associations with species, but also with caste. Now, in the ways that it uses animals for human oppression, racism and casteism do have some critical differences, right? And I'm being overly simplistic here with regards to racism, but of course, racism is, let's say, broadly understood. It's broadly founded on the dehumanization logic, where, again, Manisha's 2010 work is so useful in this regard, where the human subject is rendered subhuman or less than human through comparisons with the non-human, and a very simplistic definition or a understanding here. But casteism is distinct in the sense that casteism pairs all humans with animals. Okay, so it pairs all humans with animals, and the distinction lies in which group of human communities are paired with which specific animal species. So it's the casteism's distinction is not that humans are compared with animals, but which groups of human are compared with which groups of animals. So humans and other animals of high caste, for example, they share similar social qualities, as do casteized humans and animals of low caste. They also share certain low qualities. And I'm quoting from Wendy Doniger's Hindus in Alternative History, and she quotes the Atharva Vedas, where certain animal species and certain human castes are politically interlinked based on these shared social qualities. So for example, lucidity, goodness, intelligence is associated with cows and Brahmins. Energy, activity, passion associated with horses and Kshatriyas, or the warrior castes. And darkness, inertia, entropy, respectively dominate in dogs and low castes. Right, so you can actually see that the interlinking of social qualities between casteized humans and certain animals is so strong. So where does this place the pig? Sorry, this is another sort of, a more sort of deeper interlinking of animals and caste, and specifically in the case of cows. Again, there's a whole, and I can go on and on with examples. I'm just quoting really very few here, but some of the some of Hindu scriptures, for example, look at the comparisons they make in the case of cows and Brahmins, for example. So one who strikes a cow and a Brahmin will have their, with their foot. So if you kick a cow or a Brahmin, they'll be born lame and deformed in the next life, right? So cows are to be venerated with cows, gods, Brahmins, aged persons, holy teachers. So there's this interlinking constantly, this constant reinforcement of cows and Brahmins. And obstructing water, not giving water to thirsty cows should be considered equal to the sin of killing Brahmins. And a student asks, what is the path of misery in the world, right? And not providing support to cows and Brahmins. And these are endless numbers of examples. And by the same token here, you can see, the intertwining of buffaloes and caste as well. And that's an image that's sourced from the British Library archives in London, where the buffalo is shown as the carrier for the god of death. So the buffalo has these really inauspicious, unlucky associations, right? Sinful people. The first thing that sinful people perceive is the terrifying form of the god of death seated on a buffalo. And look at the descriptions, which is really terrifying and monstrous, right? The mountain of lampblack, terrible with weapons, possessing 32 arms, formidable fangs with red eyes and a long nose. So you have these sorts of really monstrous definitions of the buffalo. And of course, the buffalo are associated with the Dalits as well. And where does this place the pig? So you can look at, comparatively less as compared to the bovines. But again, the scriptures have a lot to say about the pigs as well. And one of them says, if one's behavior is bad, expect to enter a nasty womb. like a dog, a pig, or a pariah woman. A pariah woman is a Dalit woman, right? So they're all sort of collapsed in the same category, and it's only if you're bad that you would be unfortunate enough to have an encounter with any of these groups, a dog, a pig, or a pariah woman. So, placing this in the context of nationalistic binaries and identities, specifically in the case of Tamil Nadu, right? And as I explained, the weaponization of the pig was a pig literally weaponized. So to assert both the Hindu right, but also the Dalit right, the resistance to Hindu right, is less common and critiqued because the use of the pig itself as abject and low caste is far less politicized than the cow. I mean, what the point I'm trying to make is that pig, I realized, is quite literally as present as the cow, but virtually invisibilized, virtually silenced, right? And to sort of give you a distinct, a whistle-stop tour of how caste operates differently in North and South India, and to the extent that this plays in the instrumentalization of cows and pigs respectively. Caste, as we very broadly and generally understand today, because I did mention earlier that it's full of multiple idiosyncratic, highly confusing categories, but caste as we understand today is actually in significant part solidified as per British colonial understandings of caste, right? Because the British, the way that they understood caste is neat, it's orderly, it's organized, right? Like and of course it lends itself very easily to these sort of monolithic upper, lower, Dalit, Dravida. So it allows itself to these sort of easy binaries. And of course, the British were very invested in solidifying binaries because they obviously had to justify the colonial state. But colonial ethnography, and Christoph Jaffrelot is a key critic of Hindutva, and he says, and I'm quoting him here, colonial ethnography equated Aryans with the upper caste, very simple. Aryans with the upper caste, the Dravidans with the lowest orders of Indian society, right? So in North India, the nationalist movement was significantly driven by influential upper caste dominated Hindu political organizations. And they perceived very strong kinship and genetic interconnections with Germanic Aryanism. And that's a whole separate debate and lecture in itself in how Hindu Aryanism and Germanic Aryanism, they have such strong, close collaborative associations, right? And cow protection became a very core part of such sort of Hindu revivalist politics, particularly in the north. Now, in contrast, in southern India, particularly the Madras presidency, which eventually became Tamil Nadu state, resistance. So nationalism basically grew in the form of resistance to this upper caste Hindu domination that motivated, that was in play in the north. What motivated the south was this resistance to this upper caste, and it motivated the emergence of indigenous ethnic Tamil and also specifically Dravida nationalism. So what is Dravida? It's again another strong, long debate about who constitutes the Dravida people. But very broadly, Dravida actually includes even Christians and Muslims under their ambit, but they explicitly exclude the upper caste, which is the Brahmins and the North Indians who they typically associate as upper caste. So the fact that Dravida politics also has an exclusionary potential, so to speak, did subsequently raise a lot of anxieties about casteism mainly taking another form. Because casteism mainly taking another form, no matter, the exclusionary potential of casteism is a problem, no matter who is advocating it. So that did become an anxiety later. So for about 50 years post-independence, Dravida nationalism was quite strong. But by the early 90s, they started to have internal factionalism, and there was persistently hostile relations, particularly between two major Dravida parties. And John Harris, another major Hindutva thinker, he had predicted quite a long time ago, and that turned out to be exactly right, that the internal infighting between Dravida nationalist parties opened up the possibility for Hindu nationalism to make an inroad into the South as well, right? And it made an inroad into Tamil Nadu state politics, gaining the support of Tamil upper caste and middle class and castes. And in recent years, Prime Minister Modi has been on this charm offensive, like generally in North India, and certainly prime ministers have generally ignored Southern India, but he's been on this charm offensive to try and woo Tamil Nadu. And in like, these high profile international places like the UN General Assembly, and he in 2019 he attended this Howdy Modi event in the United States in Houston, which was the largest sort of gathering in his honor in the United States in 2019. And he quoted Tamil poets out of the way, going out of the way to quote Tamil poets and try to sort of, show an allegiance with Tamil culture. And normally when visiting heads of state visit India, their hospitality is showcased through Delhi, because it's the capital, but he, hosted the Chinese president in 2019 in Tamil Nadu. And so he's been on this charm offensive. Now, as I said, traditionally, they have had to work really hard to have a presence. Hindu nationalists have had to work really hard to have a presence in the south of India. And cow protection, which is associated with Hindu nationalism, did not really take off in the South. You don't really find all these incidents of lynching and rape and violence against Muslims and Dalits that happen prolifically around the North. That didn't really happen in the South. However, while cows didn't necessarily feature very strongly as sites of nationalistic politics in the South, they have nonetheless not hesitated to use pigs as part of the strategy to erect an upper caste state, both in the South but also in the North. Even though the North has been generally dominated by cow politics, this is the interesting thing. You'll find any number of incidences of the use of pigs. It just passes. It never gets reported in the media because pigs are just not important. As the human low caste as well. I mean, there's always been this strong agitation about how media doesn't adequately reflect the vulnerabilities and struggles of marginalized humans as well. So, for example, in Uttar Pradesh, it's a state in North India. A very Hindu nationalist state. Caste politics dominate that state, and in Uttar Pradesh, in a city called Bareilly, they have this it's a key example for it. Annually, to celebrate a major festival, they have a deeply cruel cow-pig fight, right? So in this fight, 4 or 5 bulls are forced, so to speak, to fight a lone pig. And this pig's legs are tied and flung into the midst of the boars. And, obviously you're surrounded by these loud goading humans. And the bulls get agitated, turn on the pig and gore the pig to death, right? And this signals the ascendancy of the upper caste over the lower caste. The bulls gore the pig to death, who is, by the way, tied up and has no means of struggle or escape. And the victory of the bulls, so to speak, signals the victory of the upper caste over the lower caste, over the untouchables, etc. So it is not only the cow who emerges as a key site of casteist or nationalist assertion. But the interesting thing about the use of the pigs is that both the Hindu right, and this, the example that I just quoted was that of the Hindu right using the pig, but the Hindu right and the Dalit right are invested in using the pig to erect and strengthen binary framings of Hindu Dalit, and also cow pig. It's not just Hindu Dalit hierarchies that are reinforced here, but also cow pig hierarchies, right? And the pig is weaponized by oppressed castes also. And that's really the interesting thing. Radhika Govindarajan notes in her Animal Intimacies, and I think it's a really shrewd and pertinent observation. And she says, and I'm quoting her here, more upwardly mobile Dalits in India, for example, and quoting her here, despise pigs and describe them as unclean animals who enjoy eating excrement, right, to socially elevate themselves. So the oppressed castes who are already burdened by the association with pigs kind of become even more oppressed. So I mentioned earlier that the pigs and Dalits, for example, are painted quite literally in the margins of caste geographies in India. Now, where empirically does the margins of caste geographies lie? It is quite literally in the stinking wastelands of cities. right? I mean, generally garbage disposal is a problem in most Indian cities, and you can find generally garbage disposal, just on the streets, etc., quite commonly. But this is nothing compared to a systematic purposive disposal of caste in actually the outer peripheries of Indian cities, right? So that's where I ended up, which was in the outer peripheries of Chennai city, for example. And Chennai is interesting because Chennai itself, which is the capital of Tamil Nadu, is one of India's major metropolitan cities. It is generally regarded to be a cosmopolitan city. And Chennai now becomes a landscape of these sorts of divisive, binary, Dravida, Hindutva politics. So who operates in these waste yards? And by the way, I mean, you might have seen photos, and the photo that I'm just showing here is not necessarily unique, but it is kind of unique when you're there. I'm talking about quite literally, as far as the eye can see, it's kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of waste. It is not hills, it is literally mountains of waste. Okay, mountains of waste where pigs, you'll see pigs. I mean, you might occasionally see the odd cow that's wandered in, or you might occasionally see dogs, but the species that dominates this landscapes are pigs, and the pigs quite literally rolling down. I mean, consuming, in their agitation to eat, they're consuming plastic, they're consuming just about everything. And it's populated by pigs, but also by a very, very low, one of the lowest caste, so to speak. And when I say low, well, use words like low caste, it's obviously in quotations, because these are problematic and very contested and very, they have to be in quotes, because obviously they have to be questioned and problematized. But they belong, the people who work in these sorts of these waste labor, as laborers or scavengers, they quite literally belong to the lowest amongst the lowest caste. So there is a Dalit community. So the Dalit is not a homogeneous Dalit community. It's a highly heterogeneous, diverse group of even the Dalits. There is a very so-called low caste group called the Advantatiyars, who are generally one of the lowest groups, but there is an even lower group within this group called the Malayalam Makkals, right? They are the mountain caste, they are the pig hunters. And it was so confronting, because you always hear of cow butchers being considered to be of very low caste, but then the mountain caste of pig butchers or pig hunters are considered to be even lower. I mean, it's hard to describe within the caste community of even the Dalit community how lowly they are regarded as. And their proximity to the pigs through rearing, slaughtering, and hunting pigs renders the Malayalam Makkals marginalized even by the non-Brahminical caste. Okay, so we're not even talking about the Brahminical caste here, but even with the non-Brahminical caste who weaponize pigs. And it kind of, this is this really intricate entanglement of the lowest caste human groups with pigs, which actually reveals their highly interlocking objections to scaffold caste, the sociology of caste, but also the political economy of caste. So I was speaking to this guy, and some of you might have read in my paper, where I speak to this guy called Ile, a 40-year-old man, and spent a lot of time with him through that sort of intensive phase of research, where I spent a lot of time in the dumping yard, and he explained two major key sources of their livelihood, which is one, foraging in the dumping yard. As you can see, as you can see, the pigs, these human communities also foraging quite literally alongside, trying to look for waste which can be used and recycled and and resold, and try and make tiny amounts of money that way. And also their other occupation was rearing and hunting pigs. And Eli, the man that I spent a lot of time with, he also hunted and he also reared and crossbred pigs. Now the stench, which was, I need to say it's about the stench, but the stench which was near their houses, which wasn't exactly next to the dumping yard, but close enough. But you could still smell, especially when the wind blew that way, you could smell the stench. But it became unbearable. And when I talk about I mean, it's an almost solid sense of smell. It's hard to describe. And you know how you go to, I don't know, a bar, for example, and you might have cigarette smoke on your hair, on your clothes. Quite literally, I would leave each day from these sites with a scent, with a smell of shit. Quite literally, right? On my clothes, on my hair, it was like quite literally, it is that solid, right? And you begin to get a sense, because I had the privilege of going to my hotel and taking a shower. But you can talk about this enormous sense of lack of privilege and opportunity and discrimination, because you go like, I mean, you know, how it immediately debars you from accessing jobs, from accessing anything when that smell is such an obstruction in and of itself. So we walked through this wide path where there was this massive garbage trucks would constantly come from throughout the city, dump toxic waste. And I'm talking about toxic waste, all sorts: household, plastic, medical, industrial, and most importantly, fecal waste. Okay, and as I said, it's impossible to explain. I've got videos of this, but I didn't want to upload a video in case technology played out. But it's quite a sight, right? And on these mountains is of stinking waste. There's old people, women, teenagers, children. And Sarah Jewett writes in her article, Geographies of Shit, she says, these people are segregating waste with nothing, and I'm quoting her here, nothing but their bare hands, okay? Routing through kitchen waste, broken glass, fecal matter, etc. And hundreds of thousands people make their living that way. Alongside all of these people, you also have the pigs that are foraging in equally large numbers. Like, I mean, thousands of it. I don't think you ever see this many pigs as you do in these colonies. And they're quite, they're semi-feral, they're wild, they run if you come near them. You also don't want to get too close because you might also get attacked. So they're not very domestic in that sense. But I'm quoting again from sociological research here, where the pigs are regarded as the heraldic animal of the Dalit community. Okay, and I'm quoting Winklechen, who says, both of them scavenging, removing garbage, dirt, and feces, constantly this reference to feces of high caste Hindus. But in being rendered politically worthless, humans as well as pigs, politically worthless, they actually become economically valuable because they're performing critical labor in scavenging waste. And I was like, I was constantly, it was difficult. I mean, I think back to that and I kind of feel the sense of retching coming even now. And I asked this man, I said, doesn't it affect you? And he said, we're so used to it, we don't even notice it. And he says, everyone else does and treats us literally like shit. And again, in her article of Geographies of Shit, Sarah Jewett talks about fecophobic cultures who find the concept of shit quite literally, culturally abhorrent and ritually polluting. But just to sort of anticipate just how disgusting humans generally find shit, like, when the coronavirus happened and everyone went into lockdown, one of the most searched for articles was the toilet paper, right? Everyone was trying to hoard toilet paper. There's this sense of disgust, which is really deep-rooted in humans about humans' own shit, but that also becomes weaponized, right? When the management of this shit becomes by virtue of your birth, something that you are responsible for. Again, India is not unique, and I quote my research from places like Ghana, for example, where poor migrants from Sierra Leone become, and I quote here, the personification of shit. And Asadoron and Ira Raja, anthropologists of waste in India, they say in India, for example, it is not the individual who basically shits, so to speak, but it is the body politic of the upper caste, right? So it is the body politic of the upper caste, and therefore it becomes the responsibility of the body politic of the lower caste to clean up this mess. And so defecation and waste is one thing, but equally also saliva. Right, saliva is considered to be as ritually polluting. So as we were walking through this waste, there was also these trucks that were dumping garbage, but this is purposive garbage. So they would go around to different waste, different hotels and households. So these garbage trucks would go twice a week or once a week to different hotels, and they would pick up discarded rotten food. And I'm talking about absolutely stinking food. Okay, stinking food, they're decayed food. And as you can see, I've taken a photograph here. I mean, you can only imagine the smell that emanates from this food. It's all sorts, vegetable waste, meat waste, etc., eggs, everything. And they bring this food and dump it for the pigs as well, because, you know, they also rear these pigs, and they also hunt and slaughter these pigs. And the pigs, of course, cleaned it up within minutes. But in an interspecies casteist society, this was more than just a banal observation. It wasn't just all pigs are eating. The filthy, untouchable caste pig consuming the saliva of the upper caste was an extremely poignant reminder of the social order of the upper caste, and also the body politic of privilege and oppression, both being in place, privilege and oppression, right? And again, I'm quoting here from Akhtar, who says, saliva is socially polluting, and I specifically quoting here, such food can be shared with only with socially inferior persons. Such food can be shared only with socially inferior persons, okay? So this is more than a banal observation. And again, when I went to the hunting colony, and, you know, where they bring the hunters keep bringing through the day 1 pig, 2 pigs, 20 pigs, you know, depending on how many they manage to hunt. And I talk a little bit about that in my paper. But these semi-wild, some of them are jungle pigs. They kind of move between the geographies of waste and the geographies of the urban jungle, which is not much of a jungle, but it is in terms of how abandoned it is. But these kind of jungle pigs or waste pigs, and as you can see in my previous photograph, they're black pigs as well. Okay, they're native pigs. They're kind of native Indian pigs. Of course, they have been domesticated. Of course, they've been crossbred. So they're not pure. Definitely denotes you know, even more of an association with the lower caste. And it was these pigs that. So where does this sort of geographies of waste, revulsion, where does that lead us in terms of nationalism and hardline nationalism? So in mid-2017, and this again happens quite often, there was a hardline, a hardcore, ultra-right Dravida political party that held a protest against Brahmanism. And how did they hold this protest against Brahmanism? They made, and there are lots of YouTube videos here, but you know, this is not an audience that needs to see these sorts of videos, so I'm not presenting any of that work here. So sorry, I'll just sort of present an overview of the geographies of waste. As you can see, there's any number of pigs, but also operating in the millions. And again, in the far periphery, you can see housing colonies which belong to sort of wealthier caste. But so the Harvard political party, the Dravida political party, tried to hold a protest against Brahmanism. And protesting against Brahmanism is one thing, but then they tried to do that by using these very pigs who are very shy of humans, who don't necessarily, who are quite autonomous sort of pigs. And they made these pigs wear the punal, or the sacred thread. Now, one of the sort of visible distinctions of Brahmanism is this sort of sacred thread, and they made these they made these pigs of these sacred threads. And again, the protests are really, you know, the ones on the videos are pretty awful in terms of how these pigs were dragged wearing these sacred threads through all these crowds, and many of the pigs died almost immediately. And you know, once they were rescued, taken to the sanctuary, and then they died almost quickly of cardiac arrest, presumably of cardiac arrest. They weren't. These pigs were so terrified that they wouldn't let anyone come and touch them. And I'm mindful of time here, of going over time, but I just want to quickly mention that one of the when I asked these hunters, I said, how do you feel about the fact that the pigs that they are associated with in the caste hierarchy, how do you feel about the fact that the pigs were used as a strategy of demeaning and they emphasized for me a very interesting distinction between humiliation and harassment, right? So they said, well, look, as pig butchers, oftentimes the cops would come and they would harass them for bribes because you are having this illegal meat shop, you know, on the pavement, and you're not supposed to, so that you bribe the cop. But the harassment is pretty democratic, so to speak, right? Like cow butchers get them, a fishmonger gets them. If you could be selling carrots and tomatoes on the streets, and you would also be fined. So harassment was somewhat democratic, but humiliation left far more insidious scars, and that was harder in cementing these sorts of objective statuses that harassment couldn't. Like harassment was difficult, and of course there's vulnerability, but humiliation was far worse. And he described to me a lot of ways in which the low caste were humiliated. And he said it's common, we do it back in the village, we do it, it's always been going on. So, I'm not going to get into that here in the interest of time, but he was talking about how pigs are used. He gave me these really gory examples of how pigs are used to humiliate, right? I mean, not harass, but humiliate. So again, and of course, because being, the interesting thing, however, is that for the first time, pig hunters are making money out of the sort of pig meat sale. And why is that? It's because they're being interbred. The black pigs, when they're interbred with the pink pigs, sort of the Western pigs or the landrace or Yorkshire breed pigs, their value actually increases. And upper castes and upper classes are happy to consume meat when it's sourced from lighter skinned pigs. So that's this sort of really messed up thinking, but as a result, they're really encouraged to interbreed pink pigs and black pigs, right? So he was talking about in Tamil, he was talking about pink pigs and black pigs, and it's really interesting because when a bovine becomes mixed caste, it actually decreases her value. As you could see, she was outside of the caste system. But in the case of pigs, when you become half caste and the skin lightens, it actually increases their values, right? So really quick, just to sort of starting to wrap up here, caste hierarchies, it was always imagined that somehow under a market, and also with urbanization, they would flatten out, okay? But it hasn't been the case because capitalism itself thrives on hierarchies. So caste is not strengthened, it's not weakened by the market, it is strengthened by the market because the market thrives on discriminating opportunities itself. It relies on hoarding opportunities for some, discriminating opportunities against others, exploitation of some labor to profit other sort of racialized bodies. So the caste actually is strengthened by these systems, right? And of course, when it comes to an animal, a farmed animal, who is both political capital and economic capital, the violence is sort of almost unfathomable, whether it's the case of cows or whether it's the case of pigs, and framing cows as venerable and as pigs as despicable, it actually operates for the markets. These sorts of sociological hierarchies operates and works for the market. It's not really sociological, it actually has economic value as well. So caste, just to sort of wrap up, is reliant on dehumanizing, subhumanizing, animalizing humans, but it is also reliant on humanizing and de-animalizing other animals. Okay, that is a corollary to caste. It's not just dehumanization, but also de-animalization. And just as dehumanization, of course, is profusely violent, humanization is also, and that's what I argue in my work, can be as violent as humanization of other animals can be as violent as dehumanization of animals. In the case of cows, for example, seeing the cow as mother, even above humans as a goddess, for example, sort of blurs the fact that a sacred cow is also a mundane dairy cow, right? I mean, a sacred cow is not, there's no distinction between a sacred cow and a dairy cow as far as the political economy is concerned. And elevating the cow as mother of humans blurs the fact that her vulnerabilities of a dairy cow are disregarded. So one of the things that I argue is that animating caste or seeing animals in Indian identity politics is perhaps a really vital pathway to a post-caste society. And one of the sort of troubling questions is the concept of species always going to be problematic in a caste society, given that it is sort of linked to a casteized human group or casteized humanity, but equally is the human always going to be an oppressive category for other animals. And I guess my argument is that post-casteism cannot be achieved by disregarding species as relevant to the unmaking of caste. Species don't feature in caste identity politics, but they are. I mean, I think Claire Kay makes this argument in her work on race and species, that they are intimately bound up with one another and must be dissembled together. And Animating Caste, acknowledging that caste is as profusely animal as it is raised or ethnicized, involves sort of reinstating our meta-identity also as animal, and subjectifying them and seeing animals. And there's again lots of work that talks about how humans are closer to animals than we realize in terms of cognition, socialities, genetics. But also this closeness has no moral bearing, because all sentient life is owed respect and sanctity. And once we see no meaningful differences between a human and a pig, or a human and a chicken, it is impossible. It's difficult, if not impossible, to see any momentous difference between a human and a human, right? And focusing, seeing the animals and their vulnerabilities. In this case, the pigs, for example, in the economy of the caste and the market, it kind of forecloses seeing the animals centrally in these sorts of identity politics, forecloses not the hegemony or the possibility of a Brahmin society, a Dravida society, or a human society, but I argue, based on the work of Dominic Lestel and others, that it perhaps, seeing the animal and caste politics, allows the more kaleidoscopic possibilities of a human-pig multi-species society as core to a post-caste society. So I think I will end here. And if any, I know that most of you would have had my draft paper circulated, but it's also just come out literally a few days ago in Urban Geography, if you'd like to have the final version. And I would like to end on this bunch of photos that I always like to end on. And these were all photos that were taken during my fieldwork, right? This was this is sort of transversing caste and religion, but this is a Muslim woman who used to sacrifice goats for a long time, and obviously started to an event always happens, so to speak, and she started to save goats instead. And this was this goat who was sick, and we were in a veterinary hospital, and she was crying and weeping over the goat, and they were hugging the goat, and you can just see a goat who would normally be a sacrificial animal is such a subject of love once we begin to see the animal. And again, this is a photo that I took. This cow would, on the street, would keep wandering past, and this man would always have some food ready for the cow, and she knew when to come, and he knew when she would come. And I always end also with my chickens, and that's one of our chickens. So it was rescued from an egg farm, and yeah, she is 6 years old at the moment. Doesn't like to be reminded of her age, but doing very well. Thank you so much all for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Narayanan, for your poignant and deeply insightful presentation. That was fantastic, and we so appreciate you starting your day so early to be with us today. So if audience members have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat now. I'll start us off, and you did touch on this at the end, but I wonder if you have anything else to say about how you see the nationalist-driven racial purity and casteism of pigs and cows in India working to uphold oppressive ideologies about women in India, who, as Dr. Govinderjan, I believe, has written, often take on caretaker roles of the animals.
That's an excellent question. Certainly in the case of cows, the gendered aspect is so palpable that it is so evident, because there's been substantial work done on how women, and the whole concept of Mother India, again, a very feminized body, right? The mothering body, the feminized body, how women are made to perform these sorts of these roles as cultural guardians of this pure Hindu nation. And women, cows, they all sort of are enrolled in their feminized roles, and of course the country itself is a feminized body. So these links are really strong in the case of cows. In the case of pigs, that's a fantastic question, and I'm going to have to reflect a little bit more about the gendered aspect specifically. But absolutely, there's no question that women are deeply involved with the caretaking. The pigs are also very autonomous and sovereign, and a lot of their work is done around waste and scavenging themselves. But where I think the gender aspect really stood out for me was when the vulnerabilities of gender and animals, so to speak, stood out for me was when the pig butchers were describing how they slaughtered these pigs, right? And they would tell me that they would have to be blind drunk. This was the word that they used in Tamil, that they would have to be blind drunk in order to slaughter the pigs. They couldn't do it if they weren't fully drunk, they weren't blind drunk. And there's been so much work done on how alcoholism affects women and children in Dalit communities because of the oppressive labor that the men have made to perform, the daily humiliations that they have to bear, and alcohol becomes their way of coping. Right, and there's been some really, Naila Kabir, who's based in the London School of Economics, has done some it's almost brutal, the kind of work that she's done and powerful work in explaining how alcoholism operates and renders both Dalit men and Dalit women in different ways vulnerable. But I also found that there's very little work done on the ways in which animals are also rendered vulnerable in these sorts of spaces due to the effects of alcohol. So I think that was one significant comparison that stood out for me.
Fascinating, thank you so much. Our next question is from Professor Deka. She actually has two questions, and the first one is quite similar to some things you've just addressed, so I'll read them both to you, and you can decide how you'd like to answer them. She says, thank you, Yamini, for this tour de force, both in your paper and talk. Question one, we know from feminist theories that religious nationalisms are profoundly gendered, and your work has also powerfully shown the gendering of cow as mother. Could you share your insights as to how gender may be at work to construct the pig as a potent political metaphor? And the second question, would you like me to stop there and then I can, or did you want the second question?
I can address that. I think I think this question reminded me quite instantly of fertility, and about so oftentimes Hindu nationalists would compare Muslims with pigs. And by the way, the pig is regarded as a contemptible animal for Muslims as well. They also regard the pig as unclean, etc. But as a way of humiliating or talking about Muslims in denigrating frames, they would compare Muslims and pigs, but on the basis of fertility. That Muslims tend to have large families and they breed like pigs, basically, right? Because pigs tend to have large litters, Muslims tend to have large families. So this was this really extraordinary gendered sort of comparison between Muslim fertility and pig fertility, constantly, and both in some ways being a threat to the Hindu nation, because high numbers of Muslims, even though Muslims are a minority in India, it's really interesting given that they are such a minority and Hindus still constitute 80% of India's population. It is amazing just how much of a threat the Muslim and the growth in Muslim fertility and growth in Muslim population. This is constantly the focus of demographic work as well, about this obsession with Muslim fertility. And this was certainly a parallel that kind of came very instantly to mind in the ways in which gender operates and the ways in which fertility is mobilized. And I think fertility is mobilized in a lot of nationalistic discourses.
Great. The second question here is, could you also share more about how you understand the concept of species being in the de-animalizing of animals concern that the paper importantly flags?
Well, I think I'm going to have to read Manisha's latest book, which I have just ordered, which focuses on the species being and the beingness of animals. And it's a concept that I absolutely am so intrigued by, and no doubt will be using a lot. And I addressed that a little bit in my paper in terms of the species being, but also something more generally that I wanted to address in the context of fieldwork. I, per se, as an individual, have come from a very urban sort of India, and I honestly had no interaction with animals prior to getting into animal work, which really only started six or 7 years ago. So all animals were new to me, trying to sort of understand. And I remember for a long time, like trying to sort of, over the 4 or 5 years of cow research, trying to work out cows, trying to, sort of position my body language in relation to cows, etc. But one thing I found almost immediately confronting about the pigs, and I say this at the risk of fetishizing, and I want to make the point that I don't wish to fetishize pigs in any way. One of the most confronting things about pigs, however, in doing this research was there's sort of curiosity that I perceived about me, which was almost, I don't know, the curiosity that the gaze that I felt about the pig's case, and the open it suggested such a sense of autonomy, such a sense of sovereignty. And again, Radhika Govindrajan has this wonderful term in her pig chapter that she uses called the other wild, where she says, even as pigs are domesticated, they really exceed their imbrication in human lives. And the sense of sovereignty really comes through. And this was something that I repeatedly came across with pigs, whether they were in dumping grounds. And sometimes I would find pigs in these sorts of, incarcerated, those sow crates, etc. This sense of sovereignty. And one of the most confronting photos I remember was this pig hunter was showing me on his phone. He was showing me about, he was showing me how hunting played out, because I didn't want to witness any hunting per se, but he was showing me on his phone, and he showed me the photo of a pig, a heavily pregnant sow, who was looking at him just before he shot her. And this open curiosity, it kind of really stood out in my head. So the elision of species being, and I kind of addressed that in my book, in the paper, saying, you don't want to fetishize the pig and say they're clean, because cleanliness is already a very fraught concept in a caste society. It's a fraught concept in a racial society as well. But it becomes important to address the fact that in terms of the species being, in terms of how we understand clean, and of course in very problematic racialized ways, they are clean, they are intelligent, and in ways that we value it, okay, and not that our valuation should have any moral consequence, but this constant sort of contradiction between how we frame them and how we value them was really confronting. Not sure if that answered the question fully, but yeah.
No, that was great. Very thoughtful. Our next question is from Lisa Warden, who is an ASRI member. She says, thank you so much for this fascinating analysis. Can you elaborate a little on how the understanding of animals as casteized political metaphors applies to dogs in India, specifically to the difference between attitudes towards branded, purebred, or jati dogs and indigenous desi dogs?
Fantastic question. That's a beautiful question. And it's such a pertinent question and something I didn't address in the talk. But just last year, the BJP government, the Hindu nationalist BJP government banned dog in northern India, right? Banned dog meat, and it is again this really, and the dog occupies this very fraught place in Indian politics, because on the one hand, as elsewhere, it is man's best friend, human's best friend, but at the same time, the dog also occupies a status as low caste and associated with the tribal people. And when dog meat was banned, and then there was this massive resistance against the sort of infiltration of Hindutva, including in tribal territory, and I think this was overturned. This had happened for a long time, for a short period of time, and then it was overturned. On the one hand, the cruelty that is involved in commodifying dogs, which is no different from commodifying cows as dairy animals or pigs or any species. So on the one hand, these sorts of issues, but on the other hand, it's kind of the ban on dog meat, an animal which Hindu nationalists would traditionally consider to be low caste. So here's the distinction. The dog protection is different from cow protection, because the cow protection is automatically understood as, cows are understood as high caste, but the dog is actually understood as low caste. And yet you're going out of your way to protect an animal that is regarded as low caste in your own worldview, right? But the interesting thing is, and this is the, on the one hand, the BJP has this national narrative and the national agenda of solidifying Hindutva in the national level through cow protection, but it also operates in different ways at the subnational level. Like, in southern India, it has to have a particular strategy. In northern India, in eastern India, where dog meat was banned, they actually decided to use the dog, who they would normally consider to be low caste, as a way of civilizing, bringing up, their own sort of civilizing mission, as it were, the tribal people. The civilized people don't eat dogs. Okay, so as a way of civilizing and bringing them within the ambit of the civilized Hindu caste, what you would do, one of the things you would do is stop eating dogs. Right. So here again, the dog is used as a civilizing, as an instrument of civilizing mission. And I have another paper, another work, which it'll be shortly come out at some point, which also focuses on the ways in which Hindu nationalists use the camel in Rajasthan, for example. Again, a very charismatic animal who has been recently commodified formally as a dairy animal in India. Again, the way they use the camel is not polarizing, but as a strategy of assimilation, because everyone loves the camel. The camel is a symbol of tourism in India, and assimilation, of course, is also a strategy of erasure, right? So caste operates in different ways, but as a strategic politician, you would have to instrumentalize animals in different ways, and they do that very adaptably.
Okay, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'll take this one last question here. I'm sorry, I know I'm going to pronounce your name wrong. I think it's Krishnanini Harry. Thank you for the illuminating talk. I wanted to ask for your thoughts on how animal rights activists can handle the problem of casteized speciesism. Especially the difficulty of mutual human and non-human vulnerability. In other words, how do we achieve pig and human liberation from caste oppression when the Dalits and dependents on the pig bodies are deaths for survival? Where do we start dismantling casteized speciesism?
Thank you. That is such an important question again. And one that often troubles me, and also troubles the animal activists that I constantly speak to in India. I don't do any research without turning to the activists first and foremost. I also always encourage my students also to focus on the activists who are directly working on the ground. So I really value this question about how can activism respond to these sorts of issues. And to answer this question, I'm going to take a step back and focus on the cows, right? So, for example, an animal activist working on the ground in India, and Naxal Dave, I think, does talk about it in some of her work, is that an animal activist in India is constantly in a state of being reactive, or constantly being a state of reaction to whatever is happening, right? Much more so than in the West, because you're constantly seeing an animal in distress, constantly seeing vulnerability, constantly seeing suffering, and you're constantly reacting. You're constantly reacting and having to react on the ground. And there isn't necessarily the time to think, and there isn't the time to sort of reflect and debate, because you have to react instantly, immediately to what you're seeing in front of you. And constantly the sort of high octane energy of stress and anxiety. So in this context, I was taking a step back with reference to cows and how animal activists feel when I talk to them in my interviews about this sort of caste and the caste oppressions that play into animal politics. And I'm going to, answer the big question by sort of circumventing my way through cows. An activist in India who has no Hindu nationalist sympathies, who doesn't want to oppress Muslims, who has no interest in oppressing Dalits, but you see a suffering cow in front of you, okay? There are laws that you can use and instrumentalize. And an activist who's constantly in the state of having to react to whatever is happening, they have a situation where, it's extraordinary, the kind of protection that is available to a cow, so to speak, in India, right? Like a cow slaughter ban, which other country has it? And I'll talk to these activists and I'll tell them that, by using these laws, obviously using the same laws that are also being used to marginalize and violate human groups. And they say, yes, we know. But at the same time, and this is something I think most activists in the world can relate to, there are so few wins for animals. So why can't we use what is available? And why can't we use what is available? So they constantly say that, and they will, and it puts them, it's an excruciatingly tight moral tightrope, right, for animal activists to sort of tread. But at the same, but at the same time, there has been this really strong, animal activists haven't necessarily taken on human rights issues in the ways that they should, though it is emerging. So in the next stage of my work, for example, I take my work into the informal economies of bricklins in India. And bricklins in India are sites of acute human and child rights violations, and that has been documented for a long time, but also animal rights violations. So, you have donkeys, mules, etc. And increasingly human rights and animal rights organizations are actually coming together and operating together. But in the main, this is not really the case. So it does become important for animal activism in India to sort of really profess and practice anti-caste philosophies, because in using cow protection laws as they do, they really risk being collapsed together with Hindu nationalists, right? And the same thing in the case of pigs. So, for example, in the case of pigs, as I said earlier in my talk, there is very little homegrown pig activism in India. Virtually, actually, I would say zero that I have seen. Okay, so all of the pig activism that I see circulated on social media, for example, is recirculated work from the United States or from the UK or from or from Canada or from any Western nation. So it's recirculated work, but there's no homegrown work. And this is also due to an unself-conscious sort of caste detriment, because pigs just don't feature. Pigs just don't feature. On the one hand, cows occupy this extremely shrill, not the cows don't, but the rhetoric around cows occupies this really shrill place in Indian politics. So the cows are constantly, in a way, sort of demanding attention, so to speak, at the detriment of all other animals. But pigs, just by the virtue of being low caste. But at the same time, so when I was starting to develop this work, Humane Society International India, which actually works quite autonomously from Humane Society United States, they contacted me and said, look, we'd like to have a talk with you about how can we start using this work, and how can we sort of, what would pig advocacy in India look like, right? And we started to have these, and these are ongoing discussions. We're constantly having these ongoing discussions with Humane Society, really a really interesting group in India, but they want to know, what can pig advocacy in India look like? Okay, are we going to focus on the meat, or are we going to focus on interlocking objections? And because pig meat is becoming really one of the most expensive cuts of meat in India as well. So there's this sort of dual approach, I think, that they are developing, where I'm encouraging them to think much more prominently about caste, but also assert and acknowledge caste across all of their work. So I think these are emerging, but really far less to be, there's so much work left to be done in this regard.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That concludes our Q&A section of the lecture. Thank you, Professor Narayanan, so much, and everyone for joining us in the final presentation in this academic year's ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. We look forward to restarting in September with the new 2021-22 series of speakers, and we hope you can join us then. Once again, if you're not already in our ASRI listserv, just drop an email to aasri@uvic.ca. It's also posted in the chat, or check our website when the new series is posted.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Manisha, for inviting me to be part of this series. I am so honored and so grateful. Thank you to everyone who stayed in and listened, especially the Australians, some of whom have been waking up very early to be part of the talk. Thank you.